The Tamron 150 to 500mm f5 to 6.7 Z-mount lens versus the Nikon Z180 to 600mm f5.6 to 6.3 lens. Now, both of these lenses have great image quality and both are really well priced for those on a tight budget. So, which Z lens should you buy? Find out next. We've got quite a bit to get through in this lens comparison, so I'm not going to mess around because I don't want this video to go on for too long. Let's have a look at the obvious first difference, the size. You can see the Tamron is much more compact than the Nikon, and the reason being is the Nikon has an internal zoom, whereas the Tamron has a push-pull style zoom. But watch what happens when I push the Tamron out to 500mm. I'll just lock that into place. That's the other thing about the Tamron. It has a focal length lock, whereas the Nikon doesn't. But when you look at them now, they're very close in size. In fact, I'd say, look, the Nikon is about, I'd say 2 centimeters bigger, but it just goes to show when you extend out the Tamron how close they are in size. So let's talk about weight. The Tamron weighs in at 1,875 grams. That's with the tripod collar on. Without the tripod collar, you're looking at 1,720 grams. The Nikon, you're looking at 2,140 grams, but without the tripod collar, it weighs in at 1,955 grams. When you pick up the two of them together, I think you can just ever so slightly feel that the Tamron is a little bit lighter, but you know, it's neither here nor there because they're so close in weight. The Tamron 150 to 500mm has an 82mm filter thread, whereas the Nikon 180 to 600mm, it has a 95mm filter thread. So filters are going to be slightly cheaper for the Tamron lens. The prices on both of these lenses at the time of making this video, here in Australia, the Tamron retails for $2,199 in the US, $1,199. The Nikon 180 to 600mm, it retails for $2,999 here in Australia. Over in the US, $1,700. Let's talk about focusing distance on these lenses. On the Tamron, you've got a minimum focus distance at 60 centimeters at 150mm. That is crazy. At 500mm, it's 1.8 meters. On the Nikon, still very impressive. At 180mm, it's 1.3 meters. At 600mm, it's 2.4 meters. So let's go and have a look at the difference in focal lengths between these two lenses with what I like to call now my Yoda in the garden test. So the video you're seeing now is at 4K at 25 frames per second coming out of my Nikon Z7. On the left-hand side, we've got our Tamron lens. On the right is the Nikon. I'm starting off at 150mm on the Tamron and 180mm on the Nikon. Let's push in on both lenses' maximum focal lengths. This is the Tamron at 500mm and the Nikon at 600mm. So now let's talk about the sharpness out of both of these lenses. And from my tests, you're going to see they are extremely close. I'm going to begin with this shot that I took of a flower. I've got the Tamron at 150mm at f5 using the minimum focus distance of 60 centimeters. On the Nikon, I'm at the minimum focus distance of 1.3 meters at 180mm. They are both so close. Although when you look at the Nikon, it's just that tad bit sharper. So I think they're very close on the wide ends at sharpness. Let's go and have a look at 600mm on the Nikon and 500mm on the Tamron. So for this shot, I zoomed in on the back of the Nikon Z7 and I focused on the left-hand side eye that you're looking at. On the Tamron, I'm shooting at 6.7 and on the Nikon, I'm shooting at 6.3. Next, I wanted to compare the two lenses when it comes to vibration reduction. On the Tamron though, it's called VC or vibration compensation. Now both of these lenses with the VR, you're going to have to activate that from inside your full frame Z-mount cameras. Now this is where I really think the Nikon stands out head and shoulders above the Tamron. At 150 millimeters on the Tamron and 180 millimeters on the Nikon, you can see they're pretty close. But watch what happens when I push into 500 millimeters on the Tamron and 600 millimeters on the Nikon. You'll note that the Tamron has this little tiny bit of a jitter, but it's nowhere near as steady as what the Nikon is. So who knows, Tamron may even introduce a firmware update that could address that on the Tamron lens. When it comes to focusing speed between these two lenses, I think they're pretty much on par with each other. Although with the Nikon, I found it to be more consistent in the speed going from background to foreground subject. On the Tamron, sometimes it was actually a little bit faster than the Nikon, but there were times where it had a little bit of difficulty acquiring that foreground subject. Just wanted to mention too that both of these lenses come with very decent lens hoods. You can see the one for the Nikon is quite big, as well as the Tamron. They both feel the same type of quality, but I love these style lens hoods. I do like having big, thick lens hoods like these because when I'm out in rougher weather, it helps keep the rain off the front of the lens. All right, so let's talk about some of the advantages the Tamron has over the Nikon. Firstly, it's compact. You can fit it into your camera bag, no worries, with more gear. That makes it really good for traveling. Another feature I think that the Tamron has over top of the Nikon is it has an Arca Swiss mount. So you don't have to mess around by going and buying an Arca Swiss plate to fit onto the Nikon lens. To me, another thing is the Tamron feels a little bit more solid than the Nikon. It just feels like a little rugged tank. I'd have no trouble going out in rough conditions with this because this is weather sealed. I think both of these lenses are weather sealed. As well on the Tamron, I like where they've put all the switches that you need to change things like your autofocus, etc. On the Nikon lens, however, you've got to switch right up the back of the lens where you want to switch from manual to autofocus. Now that can be a little bit of a pain, especially when you've got your hand all the way down here with the zoom and you've got to come back, and that actually puts quite a bit of pressure on your Z mount. Whereas with this one, because your hand's right there next to the zoom, you can just use your thumb and reach back and just change your switches. Also with the Tamron, and I spoke about this before, it's pretty much on par with the sharpness out of this Nikon lens. But the fact for the money saving that you save on this lens compared to this one, I still think that's very good value for money. Look at this shot, for example, that I took with the Tamron lens of a baby bird being fed by its mother. You can just see how sharp that Tamron is, even wide open at 6.7. All right, now it's the Nikon's turn. Let's talk about the advantages the Nikon has over top of the Tamron. Firstly, the obvious one, you get an extra 100 millimeters reach out of this lens. So this is really good for those that are doing, outdoor sports or birds and wildlife. I've even used this for doing moon photography. And having that little bit of extra reach means that you can get closer to the action without disturbing the birds or wildlife. And even at 600 millimeters, you can still crop in on those shots and not lose as many megapixels as compared to when you crop in with the Tamron lens. Another little tiny advantage that the Nikon has over top of the Tamron, I believe that the throw is a little bit smoother and quicker compared to this Tamron lens. It's not much. I mean, basically the Tamron is the same in terms of distance. What you do when you flick your wrist, it goes from 150 to 500. The thing is with the Nikon though, I just like the way it just turns so smoothly. And that throw from 180 to 600 millimeters is just so quick. Another advantage that the Nikon Z 180 to 600 millimeter has over top of the Tamron is that it has programmable LFN buttons around the front near the zoom here. That means you can assign different settings from your menu to those buttons. So the Nikon has an internal zoom. I believe this is an advantage over the Tamron, which has a push-pull style zoom. I believe it's more weather resistant that way. It's also better balanced when you're shooting handheld or with a gimbal. As I mentioned before, I believe the Nikon has far better vibration reduction as compared to the Tamron lens. Okay, so we've had a very good look at both of these lenses and looked at them in both video and stills. So which Z lens should you buy? Well, let me talk about the Tamron to begin with. If you're looking for a very diverse type of lens, for this type of lens, I'd be looking at using it for things like travel, outdoor sports, birds and wildlife, and the fact that you can get 60 centimeters at 150 millimeters minimum focus distance, that means you can get close in on those little intricate details in nature. So I believe this Tamron lens is far more diverse than what the Nikon lens is. The fact that it has the 82mm filter thread, I'd be using this for traveling and doing landscape and bird and wildlife photography. I'd rather have the compact size in my camera bag so I could fit more gear in. That gives me more room to put in things like second camera bodies or other lenses. I'm extremely happy with the sharpness I got out of this Tamron lens, so I would have no problem using this for landscape. Now, the other thing I need to mention too is that with the Nikon Z 100 to 400mm lens, the S lens, this is half the price of that lens. So if I was traveling continually and needed just that compact, just slightly bit lighter weight setup, this is definitely the lens I'd be going for. The Nikon 180 to 600mm lens, I believe, is a more designated specialist lens for those doing outdoor sports or birds and wildlife, and you really, really need that extra reach of 600mm. I found that the VR when I'm shooting handheld on this is just absolutely amazing. The shots I get out of it are also amazing. They are very sharp. I can't believe the quality of images I get out of this lens, especially for the price that I paid for it. I know this Nikon is a little tiny bit heavier than the Tamron, but I just feel it's much more balanced in my hand when I've got it attached to my Z7 and I'm doing bird photography. Very rarely did I need to use anything like a monopod for this lens. I just use it in combination with a shoulder strap when I'm out doing bird photography because that's just my style. I'm a bit of a run and gun type guy. At the end of the day, you know, it all boils down to the type of photography you're going to be doing and also the type of budget you have. If you want to save yourself a little bit of money, by all means, go and buy the Tamron. It is a fantastic lens. Whereas I believe the Nikon, as I said before, is a more specialist type lens for outdoor sports and bird and wildlife photography only. If you're still stumped in terms of which lens you should buy, I've made individual review videos on both of these lenses. You can go and check those out right here. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this does help you out. You can't go wrong realistically. They are both very good lenses. Never stop creating, and I'll see you next time.